Welcome to Fresh Off the Boat. My name is Arjun Seth and I run EdBrand. We are an education consulting firm based in Gurgaon, India. I'm delighted to be having this conversation with Tarini Nayak, a student I've known since maybe 2008. And she is someone who chose to go to Singapore. And I remember that she also received a fantastic scholarship back then. Tarini, I think it'll be fun to know about the decisions that you had to make in your senior year of high school, and then when you ended up going to Singapore, joining SMU, what was it like there in the first few weeks, months, semesters? So let's start with that. So welcome, Tarani.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's great to speak after many, many years, I think. Um, and I remember also, yeah, we had a lot of conversations about this back in 2008, 9, because I was someone who applied to the US, like I considered options in the US, India, and in Singapore. And I had admission at Brandeis in the US and at Duke as well. And then I was waitlisted at a bunch of schools in the US. At the same time, I even went and got my I-20 and everything, so I was kind of ready to go to Duke. And meanwhile, then I got an offer from SMU as well. Um, but again, because the whole visa thing, my mom was also like, she's an LSR alum, so she was very keen that at least try DU. I got into LSR as well, and even went and paid the deposit, so I kind of had like a seat everywhere, I think, at some point. But I think ultimately, when it came down to making the decision, of course, the year was 2009, so things were not great in the US. And in general, like every Indian, I have a lot of family there, but I happen to have a lot of family in academia in the US. Like people, one of my cousins had just gone, and then I have a couple of uncles who are professors and stuff. And in general, like the vibe was kind of, Asia is going to be the next big thing. And like, I mean, what you're seeing has kind of manifested in the last 10 years in many ways. This is what everyone was talking about then. And SMU was coming up as uh, not program, but like as a new school and things like that. I'd known of a couple of people who'd gone there, and were then working in Singapore after that. And we'd actually visited SMU the year before that, before I'd applied. And I quite liked the campus. I liked Singapore City. And I think it was a lot closer to home as well. It was a lot more comfortable. And for me at that point, I felt like I wanted to be in a city, not like a smaller town, which most of the US schools would have been. So at the time, and of course, like Singapore was going out of their way to make it more accessible for international students. So even before I got the scholarship, they provide you with a grant. So they subsidize your fees by almost 50%, on the condition that you work here for 3 years afterwards, of course. But for most international students, if you're going to, come here and study here, your number one goal would also be to work here afterwards. So that's not really as binding as it seems, even though it's called a bond. Um, at least to me, it wasn't. So I think that's why at the time I chose Singapore. I definitely understand and like can see it now, having seen a lot of my friends go through the US programs, versus my experience. Obviously, the experience is very, very different, academically, in terms of the campus life, socially, in many, many, many different ways. But I think it gave me a base in Singapore, and it has like Singapore's basically like a second home now.
Wonderful.
I
Yeah.
think in
So
hindsight, yeah, there's no regrets about that.
right. So if you remember your early sort of days and settling in, what is it that you feel students should know about SMU and the system there, academics and sort of social life?
Yeah, so I think academically it's definitely a lot more rigorous than I was ready for. I was also coming from an Indian school, which is very big on sort of balancing academics and extracurriculars. Like Srirang is known for that. So academically, it was definitely way more intense than I was anticipating. And I think the one big difference is, compared to the Indian system, if you haven't done IB, for example, the approach is very, you do whatever you want during the year. You study hard for your board exams, do well on those, and you're set. Whereas the approach here is a lot more like IB. Like your assessment is a lot more spread out through the term, through the semester. There's a lot of emphasis on like group projects, group work. The final exam will only be like 30 to 40% of your grade, but there's a whole 10 to 20% that just comes from participating in the classroom, for example. Things that are typically, at least 10 years back, were not so emphasized in the Indian education system. And I think that was the biggest adjustment factor, which is why you can like clearly see that on my transcript as well. Like first year is when I really struggled, and then as soon as you get used to that, I think it's also not so much getting it's just knowing that that's what it's going to be like. So you don't come in with that expectation, but once you realize that that's what is required of you, I think it's I mean, if you've gotten into the school, typically you would have the ability to adapt and like kind of get used to that quickly.
Sure. So Singapore Management University, by the very terminology, is a business kind of school, and
Yeah.
there are several tracks. Along with what you study, say in the finance program that you were signed up for, what is it that you do as part of clubs and organizations which are related to finance, or even other areas of just understanding
So
management?
actually, like you said, because it's a business school, it's modeled a lot along the lines of some of the graduate business schools that you have. So your clubs are very typically like, there's a debating, and I mean, this is a mix of what I've seen in undergrad schools and business schools as well. You have your regular like dance clubs, debating clubs, like social clubs, etc. But then you also have a finance club, consulting club, etc., which are very geared towards just the recruiting side of it or participating in like case competitions and things like that. But I was actually enrolled in the School of Economics, so that was my primary major, and then you can do, because you can do your electives across any of the six schools, you can also pick up a second major across any of the six schools. So finance was the second major that I picked up, but you can do that similarly in psychology, political science, computer engineering, or information systems, as they call it, marketing. So that actually allows you, it is still within the field of business and science overall, but it gives you flexibility as to if you want to do anything outside of your primary major, you can do a second major in that as well, which works quite similar to they call it a double major, but actually it equates to what would be a major and a minor in a US school.
So you graduated and also worked in a financial trading firm for 4 years. So what do you think you actually learned at SMU that was useful? And what obviously industry expects is maybe a lot more than that. And there may be something specific to that industry which is not taught in university. Uh,
Yeah.
what did you learn in economics and finance that you could form some sort of a framework to adapt in the work environment that you finally were at?
Yeah, so I mean, I will say that like none of this is stuff that you can't pick up on the job as well, or a lot of it is stuff that it's not like you can't pick up on the job. But I think because I'd done my finance major, at least in the firm that I was at and the role I was in, it was a lot like I had a foundation already in what are the basic financial instruments that I use, forwards, futures, options, etc. How are they valued? What do FX markets work like? What does currency exchange work like? Things like that, which definitely helped me in the role that I was in. Ultimately, it'll obviously come down to what kind of role you're in. But I think the one thing that makes SMU stand out from some of the other Singapore universities, and I would say when compared with something like Delhi University as well, is because it's modeled along the lines of business school, you also do a lot of core classes and classes outside your exact subject area. So, like you do negotiation, you do management communication. So I think in general, like you get a lot of opportunities to work on like your presentation skills, your interview skills and things like that, which was given a lot of emphasis at SMU, which I noticed doesn't usually happen at some of the other Singapore schools. And I think that helps a lot just in terms of, when it comes to applying for jobs, writing your cover letters, writing your resume, or prepping for interviews. It helps a lot with that as well. And even in the workplace, I think just like how you conduct yourself in a team meeting, in a group discussion and stuff, it makes you a lot more comfortable from the get go, I think.
Fantastic. This is very insightful. For students who are looking for careers in finance, and in your case, you have spent enough time in a very international trading company. So we'd like to know more about what a trader's sort of skill set should be, and what are the different career paths within a financial services firm which focuses on that. And then, of course, your current role at Accenture, which is a consulting company. We'll talk
Yeah.
about that as well.
Yeah, so I think, at least in my experience, what I noticed in trading is a lot of the people who start out there, and have spent many years there, it's just kind of like a lifelong job. Like you do it because you love the industry, you love the job, you love the thrill that comes from it, and that's it. And that's kind of what motivated my decision to go to business school as well, was because I wanted to branch out from that and not kind of get siloed into that for the next 10, 20 years. Um, in terms of the skills required, I guess obviously your quantitative skills need to be really good. You need to be a good risk taker and open to taking risks, obviously. And you need to be kind of, I think, very analytical, very detail oriented, and quick to make decisions. Um, Having said that, though, I think people who do it, like I said, they do it for their love of the job and their passion for it, and they're very happy doing that for like 10, 20, 30 years, and they will retire like a trader who's sitting on like years of kind of experience in that commodity or in that space, but never having really seen much of the rest of the world, to put it that way, which is kind of what I didn't want to do. And I think that's where I felt that consulting would give me a much broader exposure. And business school had always been on my mind, and I knew that business school was a good way to kind of try and move to consulting. And that's when and why I decided to apply to business school as well.
Great. So, what were the options in your head? Like, business schools have their own kind of clusters. This school is known for finance, this one's known for general management, this one's for marketing. What were you thinking? And of course, you ended up going to a very coveted one, London Business School. But what were the choices you were making?
Yeah, so that's true for sure. But I would say that I think between finance and consulting, like the top 10, 15 business schools are um, equal game in those two
Got it.
sectors. There may be some that are stronger for like more niche things like tech or VC or something. But for finance and consulting, like consulting firms hire from the top 10 schools, I think across the board. So the criteria for me became not so much like the specialization of the school, but more like what the school itself is like and where the school is located. Um, and I think by then, obviously, I was a lot more grown up in terms of making these decisions than when I was 17, 18 and applying for my undergrad. And I knew that I wanted to be in a city. I didn't want to be in like a small remote town somewhere. So I looked mostly at schools that were in big cities. So even in the US, for example, I looked at U Chicago. I looked at Booth, but I didn't apply to too many schools in the US for that. That was one reason, and the second reason was I was quite clear that I didn't want to stay on and work in the US afterwards. In which case, it didn't really make sense to me to go to the US in the first place. I also felt that London was a city that I really liked, was comfortable with, was similar to Singapore in some ways, but also had like a lot more to offer. And I'd been to LBS again the year I was applying. I really liked the campus, I really liked the area and stuff. And that's why I decided to. So when I got in, so business school typically works a bit differently in the sense that you have like 3 or 4 rounds, and if you're not successful in one, then you can go on to apply to more in the next round. But like when I got into LBS, I decided not to apply to any more schools because I was very happy with that.
Great. And how is it like the curriculum, having done undergrad business and going back to an MBA program? What are the takeaways for a student who's done that, like undergrad and postgrad?
Yeah, I think in terms of the basic curriculum, it is actually quite similar, other than the fact that your electives would be a lot more detailed or a lot more advanced. But if you actually look at the course catalog for the core courses, for example, at SMU versus any business school, it would be quite similar. And I mean, the SMU core curriculum and a lot of the electives are modeled on the Wharton curriculum, so there's obviously no surprise there. But I think the biggest difference is obviously that now you're in a classroom with people with so much experience. You have people with like anywhere from 2 to like 10 years of experience across sectors, across industries, across geographies, especially. And I think that's one thing that makes LBS really stand out and different, is that the classroom is a lot more diverse than any other school. So I think for both LBS and NCR, that's one of the biggest standout factors. Whereas in any US school, you'd have like 40% internationals at best, at the MBA level. In LBS and NCR, it's like 90% internationals. So just the cohort and the kind of people you're interacting with is obviously so different, and especially from Singapore, where SMU was my majority Singaporeans, about 20% internationals, which is also predominantly Indians and Chinese. So the cohort itself is just so much more international, which makes it a lot more exciting. And then, of course, like the experience that everyone's bringing to the table, because everyone there has worked for several years in different industries. So it's the same classes essentially, but the way you see people, the classes being conducted, the people participating, etc., obviously adds a whole other dimension to it.
I have a next question about getting into a good business school like LBS. Are there anything which is very specific to LBS in the whole admissions process, which people will have to sort of dig deeper to find out?
Actually, yes, I would say both for LBS and INSEAD. Again, back to my point about how their biggest standout factor is the diversity quotient. Personally, I've found that both LBS and NCR really look for international experience. So having worked, lived, and studied in a few different places always helps. And I can tell you in my class, for example, I would be hard pressed to think of someone who had not done at least 4 to 6 month project outside of the country where they've grown up and lived. So even if it's someone who's been in India all their life, gone to DU, works in India, they would have taken that initiative to do like a 6 month assignment or internship, or just like a rotational assignment outside of the country. So be it Hong Kong, US, Europe, wherever it is. And one of the questions on the LBS application is actually, what is your most significant international experience? So that is definitely something they look for, and I would say NCR is probably similar in that way, and I think that's also how they kind of maintain that class, or that aspect of the class, because even at orientation when you're meeting people, it's always like, hi, I'm so and so, I'm originally from here but I live there. So you'll never
Got it.
find someone who's kind of like been in one place their whole life, and I think
That's
that's something they really look for.
super. So then, after graduating, again coming back to Singapore, when the whole world is available to you to sort of then branch out, how did that decision pan out? I know you wanted to shift to consulting, so that worked out. Uh, but how come back to
Yeah,
Singapore?
so I think that kind of, I mean, it was again just a factor of the recruiting process. When you are applying for consulting roles, you have to declare your location first, and you rank your preferences. And typically, you interview with your first preference. If you interview with your first preference office, the second and third won't consider your application further. And obviously, from that point of view, I knew it made sense for me to put Singapore as my first preference office, because I have experience in this area. I just have a lot more to add to a role in this area, as compared to London. And that's why I decided to apply to Singapore. I'm also a resident here, so it made sense for me to come back.
Super. So,
Um,
can you tell us a little bit about consulting roles for undergrads versus a consulting role for an MBA from a top university like LBS? What are the different kinds of jobs that you would do as an analyst, and now if you're an MBA, what are the different things that you would do compared to what an undergrad would do?
yeah, I think, I mean, typically as an undergrad, you would join as an analyst, whereas as an MBA, you would join as an associate or consultant, like different firms call it different things. And I think in terms of the workplace, like obviously as an analyst, just the nature of the role is a bit different. There'll be more data crunching, for example. There'll be more like slides to build, maybe. But and all of that applies as a consultant as well. I think it's just your expectations in terms of the fact that you've been to business school and you bring a couple of years of work experience with you. You may be expected to like have more of an opinion on certain things in terms of just by virtue of having worked in an industry before. So you would be expected to add some value based on your past experience as well, and you would also be expected to be better versed with like just managing people, managing a team, managing your own work stream, etc.
So, being a consultant in this time when there are issues in the economy, there's obviously the pandemic. Uh, what is it that's keeping the team really engaged? Just to get a sense of the pace of you know a day-to-day job at a consulting firm?
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the more interesting and exciting things about consulting, that, even when there are all of these issues, then you have your clients coming to you and saying, how do I deal with these issues? And that's when what you have to offer to them is of even more value to them, because they're in like such a fix. And when you see your suggestions and stuff coming to light in their business even more quickly, for example. Um, so I think across all clients, whether it's private sector, public sector, everyone is looking for some sort of answers or some sort of help with how to analyze the or like how to approach the situation going forward, right? Because just like uncertainty is at like an all-time high. Um, and I think where consulting also brings a lot of value is having worked with many firms in the same industry, you're able to kind of leverage that and share expertise across firms. Like, this is how someone in your industry, or this is how someone with these nuances would be approaching this, and it's worked for them, or it hasn't worked for them, and for what reasons. So just being able to share those kind of insights across clients is also quite helpful to them.
Wonderful. I hope your clients definitely figure out what they have to do, and
Yeah.
things go back to some sort of normal. But what is Tarini doing personally? I mean, I'm going to switch gears and get to know you as a person during this era of lockdown, shelter in place. What are the things that you've reflected upon? What have you done
Um,
with mind, body, and soul to sort of become a better person?
well, I think one, moving back to Singapore, definitely, like when the first few months when I moved back, I was like very unhappy about it, and I was like, oh, London was such a great place, why did I leave, etc. But I think that's one thing that I've been very, very grateful for come lockdown, just like Singapore being the kind of place it is. Your life is almost as normal as you could want it to be. I think it's also worked out well for me because I'm living with my sister here, so that way I haven't been too far from family, etc. uh, but yeah, I've been, like I was saying, the weekends are almost like the busiest part of our week now, because we have to like cook ourselves, clean ourselves, all of that. But you're getting finding a way to kind of enjoy that and make that productive, but also make it like, a time to kind of, like, we actually enjoy cooking now, so we try something new every weekend. And I used to enjoy eating out a lot. Now that's obviously turned to the home. But yeah, we have like our own Instagram page on this now. We try something new out, and then like spend a lot of time on that. But yeah, that's basically what I've been up to.
So, other than finance and say consulting or management related books, non-fiction articles, etc., what is it that you enjoy reading or following? The kind of people that you sort of want to know more about? Just share,
Um,
yeah, something about your interests.
Yeah, well, my recent reading has been pretty much all pandemic related, to be very honest. I've been like following every single person's opinion and like views on it, whether it's like all the consulting firms or WEF, or like, everyone has their own view on it. And I think that kind of is very important right now to, um, because there's so much uncertainty, things are changing every week, every month, just to kind of have an outlook on things. So I've been reading a lot about that. Typically, I don't enjoy reading that much non-fiction. Sorry, no fiction. I prefer reading non-fiction. So I just read "Becoming" by Michelle Obama, and now I started "Educated" by
Right,
Tara
Tara
Westover.
Westover.
Yeah, yeah. So that's the kind of stuff I have been reading. But otherwise, it's mostly just like current affairs stuff.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think this question, since you talked about Michelle Obama, I think being a woman in the financial sector and now consulting, uh, of course, you're in a very cosmopolitan city, but what are the challenges or the glass ceilings or whatever you may call them? Not necessarily just for you. What do you see are the things that could be better for women and women in leadership?
Yeah, I think I've definitely been very, very privileged to work in environments where that hasn't been an issue at all, um, both in terms of the company being flexible or supportive enough, and also just like managers never seeing that as a glass ceiling or a limitation of any sort. And of course, like I think I also personally have not come across any major issues, or like, circumstances have not demanded it yet. But I think one of the things that can be done and is being done increasingly is definitely like flexible work arrangements. Um, because, and I think that's only going to be propagated further with this whole work from home situation now. But I've seen so many people, especially at the MD level now, at Accenture, for example, who are able to kind of come up with what works for them so that they can manage, like, family and home and everything. And that's going to become even more important now if like people are working from home. There literally is no separation between like your personal life or managing your children and your home and your workspace, right? It's all in one big space. But being able to manage your time, or like the company giving you the same opportunity but with the flexibility to manage your time, whether it's working 80/20, like 4 days a week, or like, certain changing your hours around the day. I think as long as you're able to deliver at the same level, that's something that is really important to have in your work environment.
Super. You've talked about uncertainty a lot as in helping
Mhm.
clients. And here I am back in Gurgaon working with students and parents who are kind of confused and worried about the uncertain times. As a person who's made choices and have probably had to face several uncertainties yourself, what advice would you give high school students who are thinking of studying abroad or even dealing with all kinds of uncertain sort of uncertainties? What has worked for you?
Yeah, I mean, the unprecedented has apparently become like the most highly used word of this year, right? So, I think, especially at the undergrad level, like you have to think about your time horizon as well. At the undergrad level, you're going into like a 3 or 4 year program. You have no idea what things are going to be like 3 or 4 years. So there's only so much you can do to like hedge your bets. And at some level, you have to kind of make an educated but informed decision, and then just start planning for things or always plan for things in advance, whether it's reaching out to the right people, building your profile from day one, in terms of what kind of jobs you want to look at, what kind of industries you want to look at, and always keeping an eye out for like what aligns with your interests but where the opportunities are as well. So like, say you go to the US to study now, but jobs for something you're interested in are really big in like Hong Kong. It's important to like reach out to the, I think especially now with like everyone so connected, um, look at people who've kind of moved, made similar moves, made similar career switches. Reach out to people on LinkedIn. Like I've had so many, I think again because there's so much uncertainty, in the last 2 months I've had so many people reach out to me to talk about LBS, and they always want to ask like, what was your experience like? And again, unprecedented is the best way to put it, because I tell them like, this was my experience, but I can promise you yours is not going to be the same. I also can't tell you how it's going to be different and how different it's going to be. But you have to kind of take a baseline estimate, and then make your decisions based on that, especially for business school, where it's different from undergrad in the sense that you could go this year, you could go next year as well. It's not going to change things that much, but then you have to look at what are your trade-offs if you go next year versus this year, and what is your opportunity cost. Like, can you really afford to defer it by a year? If you can, that's great. If you can't, then it may be more worthwhile to go now. At the undergrad level, that's different obviously, because deferring by a year means taking a gap year and then having a plan for that as well. Um, but then, of course, you have 4 years to plan for your post education um, outlook.
Wonderful. I think you've summed it up really well, and I'm sure listeners, viewers would learn so much from your journey. And thank you for sharing so honestly, so openly about things that you've been doing in the past, and looking forward to following your work in the future.
No
There are
problem.
students, many more, who are now definitely applying to colleges in India and in Asia, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I would
I'm sure.
imagine this year we'll see a big change in where people apply.
Right. So we will be organizing a few panels, and if it time permits, and if it works out for you, love to invite you on those. So thanks again, Tarini. Be
No
safe
problem.
and look forward to seeing you sometime.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.